Xirtus.
And in case you need an example, I'll open up with one about revenge. In this inexplicably gnarly episode about South Park, in a coming-of-age story, Eric Cartman, in attempts to buy his way into adulthood, is tricked by an older boy named Scott Tenorman. This cons Cartman into purchasing a bag of pubic hair. Infuriated with this hazing, Eric decides Scott Tenorman must die, and spends the remainder of the episode planning his conspiracy to incite a riot, his agenda, to leave Scott Tenorman far worse than dead. After Eric Cartman eventually tricks Scott Tenorman into eating his own parents in Chef's Chili in front of his favorite band, Radiohead, making Scott Tenorman cry and repulse his favorite musicians, leaving Scott Tenorman orphaned, alone, confused, bewildered, with Cartman sopping up his tears, literally. Now, some might think this is an extreme and despicable story, but it's an important tale, like the one about the boy who cried wolf. You see, when I first saw the episode, Scott Tenorman Must Die, I was wearing the same microfiber orange pants as Scott Tenorman. What did I think from this? Don't be like Scott Tenorman. Be good to the young, because they'll be there for you when you're old. And conversely, don't be bad to the young, because when they're bigger, they're gonna get you. Or worse, or if they're clever enough, they'll do it now. I remember sitting in a bar in Slovenia in the year 2001, watching South Park Civil War reenactors revisit the War of Northern Aggression in German with Slovenian subtitles. And it occurred to me then how influential South Park had become around the world. Particularly interesting that this be the episode, one about the Confederacy. One where, even though they've been told, of course, that they're not allowed, they realize, with a bit of schnapps, that they can win this war. And with the enthusiasm of General Lee Cartman, the South Park reenactors not only win on behalf of the Confederacy their play, but begin to march on Washington, and with a steady supply of liquor, are able to accumulate enough men to reconfederate the United States and force Bill Clinton to sign a treaty with the South. All this to what end? Not because the men have some agenda of racism, but some demand of dignity for their history, but also a more nefarious goal is laid. Because it is really resolving a bet between Eric Cartman, Stan, and Kyle. A bet that Cartman cannot win the war, waged on slavery, not to enslave the masses, but whichever one loses the bet, for 1 month, to the other. This form of gambled personal indentured servitude seems to expose some lost truth about the War of Northern Aggression and the questionable merits of its justification. Another interesting aspect to South Park are the South Park cows. The official mascot of South Park is the cow, their team and their cheerleaders, and essentially they worship the cow. And with all due respect, what better to worship? Some douche or a turd sandwich? The cow is a noble animal. The cow is weirdly graceful, and it gives us milk and butter. The ancients have revered the cow for many millennia, and many have learned to not kill each other or animals in order to live just from the milk of that cow. And let me tell you about the middle of America, the dairy mafia is real. So the question of the ethical treatment of the cows is provoked, and the question arises, maybe we should not derogate the cow. Maybe we should worship a douche or turd sandwich instead. But maybe we should look beyond the douche and the turd sandwich back to the cow and see why the cow is so valuable to South Park. Because in the South Park symbology, the cow is not a vacant, empty, hollow symbol. In South Park, it is revealed that the cows are actually a highly evolved and sophisticated species, capable of telepathy and deep pontification. These cows are so valuable, so glorified in South Park, that they are the main communicators with the divine and supernatural, not only through the character Jesus' proximity to cows, but also through their relationship to extraterrestrials, a significant part of the South Park experience that many people are being probed by aliens. And for a long time, many cows were as well, until the extraterrestrials realized what they were doing was wrong. To the cows, anyway. And they made contact with the cows and connected with them and made a treaty and extended a laurel branch of peace. And so since then, it's been clear the aliens that watched the show called Earth decided to cancel our culture. And then our best bet for saving the entire Earth is the extraterrestrials' affinity for cows. And so this is why we must take care of the cows and cheer them on, because they that probe us like the cows better than us. And it's just something that we eventually learn to live with. Some of us live better than others. The irony being, right about the time that the aliens decided that they loved cows, humans decided to become vegetarians. And it's one thing to be a vegetarian, but a vegan. But essentially, vegans have no place for these animals. And so without farmers to keep growing them, there will be less cows. Because of breeding practices for the last few centuries, there may be no wild cows in the future at all. It really depends on a lot of things. For one thing, if we stop eating meat, then it won't just be the unethical treatment of cows that is ended. Many animals that no longer suited the amusement or the necessity of man have gone by the wayside. Cows could easily be the next rhino or dragon. That is to say, an extinct species that people already think as fantastical and may have never existed, where future generations are more and more skeptical of its existence. And why not be skeptical of this supernatural vegetarian animal that produces milk for more than its own species? One with stories of blue gods who lived on nothing but its butter. Something told tale about aliens in farms in Alabama, Arkansas, Colorado, etc. would abduct and leave cleanly behind, with all of their blood and organs removed, with supposedly beyond human surgical precision, perhaps done with lasers. Cows, even as they exist today, are already somewhat of an enigma. Our relationship between them as domesticated animals going back to a wild time is mythical. And bronco rallying is hecka brutal. I mean, have you ever seen one of those rodeos? Here, check it out.
Heartbreak.
Going to show him the front of the chute, give him a real close look at that, and then a big look to the right, back around to the left. And that's the thing with this bull. They can't really draw a beat on him because I've seen him be a 45-pointer and never even turn back. You know, he can go straight and still be really ranker, but when he finds a direction, he's just off.
So as you can see, I think cows are pretty cool, and I love cows. And I even like the running of the bulls. I mean, let those bulls run over people. Fine. Seems pretty fair. But it's historical. But the sad thing is that the cows are going by the wayside, because the more and more all we need are plants, the less and less all we need are animals that eat them. And South Park tackles this by having Beyond Burgers come into town. A goo man, he says he is, comes to replace all the meat and all the school products with a vegetable protein goo. A sort of oil, if you will. Very much based on the conniving and heartless character played by Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood. But this presents our civilization with a new dilemma. What do we do with all of the cows when we don't want to eat them anymore? And South Park's already dealt with the idea of never being born in the future to begin with, but the cows become a more immediate dilemma. Back in the first seasons of South Park, the running of the cows is about a number of the cows committing suicide, and no one understanding why. Years later, it's far too clear.
Ahead lies the Arctic shore, and beyond, the sea. And still the little animals surge forward. Their frenzy takes them tumbling down the terraced cliffs, creating tiny avalanches of sliding soil and rocks, and seemingly indestructible lemmings. They reach the final precipice. This is the last chance to turn back. Yet over they go, casting themselves bodily out into space. Seem to survive the ordeal, for now they begin to swim. Not toward land, strangely, but away from shore, toward the far horizon. Others find the beaches by roundabout ways, and they too plunge into the waves. It's not given to man to understand all of nature's mysteries, but as nearly as he can surmise, it would appear that the lemmings consider this body of water just another lake. And if it's a lake, then it must have a farther shore. And so they strike out boldly. But gradually strength wanes, determination ebbs away, and soon the Arctic Sea is dotted with tiny bobbing bodies. And so is acted out the legend of mass suicide and destruction of a species, it would seem to be. Except that nature, in her infinite wisdom, has spared a few. Back on the Arctic plain, there remains the small handful that did not make this fatal journey. And in time, new generations will take the place of those that have been lost. And yet, when the population cycle mounts to another peak, the lemming legend will be told again, and will come to this same amazing climax, a final rendezvous with destiny and with death.
Was a 1958 documentary by Disney. Contrary to popular belief, lemmings don't commit mass suicide. In the wildlife documentary White Wilderness, a few dozen lemmings were imported to Alberta, Canada, so they could be filmed in their supposedly natural habitat. They used the turntable to launch the lemmings over a cliff into a river and filmed this in the same way, making it seem like a mass lemming suicide was taking place. The theory behind why they would commit this mass suicide, as explained by narrator Winston Hibbler, is that they get all worked up from the frenzy of running with all the other thousands of lemmings. In the film, he then proceeds to explain how the lemmings are approaching the sea, which is actually just a river because, in reality, Alberta is landlocked, at which point, driven by the hysteria, the lemmings cast themselves into the sea. None of this is true. Lemmings actually prefer to be on their own.
And so these wild cows, abandoned by their farming master, in a field where the marijuana is worth more than the corn or cows themselves. The cows become a nuisance, which must be done rid of. And for the sake of the vegetarian pot smokers, all of the cows are murdered. And there's a certain amount of genius subtext to this. The fact that over 20 years, the story has evolved about the cows in such a surreptitious and subtle way, claiming the identity and the rights of the cows. I mean, even in the video game Stick of Truth, they have Nazi cows, which plays really well into the whole idea of these self-determined, these collectivist, fascistic bovines who've literally been holocausted and so now have banded in their own defense for the sake of cattle and ungulates everywhere. To, I might imagine, very little empathy to most people, but it's still an important lesson to ponder. Eventually, the kids learn about the mistreatment of the cows and decide that they can no longer abide the mistreatment of animals. Once wooed by the glamours and vanities of evil, eventually the boys understand that veal is simply slaughtered baby cows. And in so much as this is true, this principle bleeds into every aspect of their lives, from Santa Claus to the Easter Bunny. And never again can a hamburger or the tooth fairy seem completely innocent. Suddenly to them, the natural occurrence of eating veal becomes totally alien to them. And so the children rescue the baby cows, who eventually are returned to the rancher but are no longer worth anything as veal because they've been moved around too much and have grown. For this, it is possible to speculate that the relationship between the aliens and the boys is strengthened insomuch as their regard for the cattle is admired by the aliens. It's not that the boys become vegetarians. In fact, they learn that that's not the answer. Certainly, it's not the answer of the aliens who end up dissecting humans and cows anyway. Perhaps the aliens were not very different, but one thing is made clear: that the fates do not afford themselves lightly on the pious in South Park. Those who say they love animals find out that they will receive no such sympathy from the universe. And indeed, all of their ethics, the pious, are questioned. So South Park delivers a prejudice that all those who claim to be great beings are not without their Jungian shadow. You know how many people at PETA want to and proactively work towards eating meat and even human grown out of a dish? Way more than none. Way more than you'd want to know. A lot. Probably way more than that. And this kind of cancel culture has long been at odds with South Park, where, as the chief fool of the day, South Park can judge whom is the most ridiculous. And invariably, the most ridiculous is the most self-righteous. And the more self-righteous, the more absurd and maniacal and perverse their agenda and debauched are these self-righteous accidental antagonists. As if to say, it is not their ego, it is the superego they're possessed of, which permeates through them in Tavistock theatrics.
In the 20th century, the human race was confronted with such a natural phenomenon as globalization. Globalization can be defined as the process of concentration of power over all the mankind in one person or a small group. This process has been underway throughout the whole human history and is now near completion. Centuries ago, ancient Egyptian priests became aware that globalization can be controlled. They have worked out the overall principles and patterns of controlling society to achieve their own goals, and headed up this process. There are no facts, only interpretations. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. A whole nation, or separate social classes, can be ruled much more efficiently after being brainwashed with various ideologies, religious dogmas, sociological doctrines, and mass media. And if need be, at some point in time, people start being collided by activation of inherent contradictions using some special techniques such as provocations, assassinations, scandalous news articles, caricatures, or deliberate mistakes which seem to be accidental from outside. For example, we are now witnessing the attempts to set the traditional Islam and biblical Christianity against each other. One of the most powerful means of brainwashing is television. Despite common beliefs, the mass media are actually programming reality so as to form people's attitudes to various events, rather than reflecting the objective reality.
But anyway, enough about the cows. Bebe has boobs. This is a sort of fact that has emerged in the community of South Park during the immediacy of their youth, that one of them, Bebe, has begun to develop into a woman through puberty. And to the girls, this is threatening, and to the boys, this is fascinating. Bebe seems to be the most interesting person in town. They don't understand how they did not notice before how interesting Bebe has been. Each one of them becomes primitive and angry and jealous of each other, casting rocks and sticks like at the beginning of Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. And while the social values of aesthetic are impressed upon the young women, the young men realize not to be manipulated by boobs, or rather to be particular about their manipulations, because stoicism and mania shall be our downfall. And when Wendy arrives with enlarged artificial breasts, in order to impress the young lads, it is to no avail. Wherefore the boys have realized that true greatness is immaterial.
Lucky that my breasts are small and humble, so you don't confuse them with nothing.
Though they are impressed, and impressed indeed, with young ladies, it is their obsession with improving their imagination, which they value the most. And so begins their lessons in learning to control themselves, and not only to fart, and to know the time and place for overreaction. And it's a social lesson that they all must enforce, and they all work together to learn. A lesson in how to beat the game by playing it together over and over. How to beat the game by letting each other win, and not to lose the opportunity to play that is being afforded to you. In school, Mr. Garrison, their teacher, is a deranged, homophobic, closeted homosexual. He has an extraordinary amount of personal issues which make him incompetent both as a person and as an adult, let alone as their teacher. For many years, he paraded around with a hand puppet named Mr. Hat until his puppet, Mr. Hat, abandoned him. He feels neglected because he was not molested as a child, and eventually he becomes the President of the United States. Mr. Garrison. Mr. Garrison. Well, what can I say? There's another. There's Mr. Mackey. Mr. Mackey is a pretty cool guy, okay? Apparently he's based on an actual advisor from Trey Parker's school. I do hope at some point he sent him a car or something. Mr. Mackey is a beautiful human being, a sexually frustrated, lonely man, a lifelong virgin until season 5, whose lover dies under suspicious circumstances. A case never fully resolved because the children were so busy dealing with the evolution of their sea monkeys, which, via a dark alley, Cartman was able to combine with human DNA. And all through the years, they worked together and against each other, playing out life's personal dramas in order to beat the game, because they have to play the game, and we cannot lose this game. We have so little time. Life is so short. People die all the time, often before they're ready. The practice of Kenny dying most every episode, in order to illustrate the impermanence of life and the essentiality and desperation of staying in the moment and being here now. So often the brutal and unjustified death of their loved one becomes the justification for their own great deeds. Very few savor life to the extent of these 4 boys. And the way they do it is they stay in the present. We have to focus on here and now, because who we are being now is who we are becoming. If life's just a show, then you might as well write the best ending you can. But there's a darker question to ask about these 4 little boys. Why is it that nobody ever grows in South Park? And I think I have the darkest answer for you, and it's not just because it's a television show. You see, South Park, is the own personal hell of Trey Parker. I don't know if he realized this when he made the show, but it's becoming far more clear. And looking at this from a Dantonian perspective, the idea that South Park is hell, that South Park is Neverland, and they are in the inferno, the ritualistic death of Kenny explains more than their immortality and the ritualistic resurrection of Kenny, episode by episode, but actually the intricacies of their own despair. In the rings of hell of South Park's inferno, each character acts out of selfishness and desperation. Horrible atrocities are committed by each character. In South Park, it truly is an immortal life of sin and debauchery.
All the crimes on earth do not destroy so many of the human race, nor alienate so much property as drunkenness, Sir Francis Bacon. It's possible to completely eliminate or subdue a whole nation to one's own will by means of such genocide weapons as drugs, alcohol, tobacco, several types of vaccines, and genetically modified foods. Yet to keep people unaware of the destructive nature of these weapons, they have been disguised as superficially harmless means of relaxation, stress relief, amusement, and acquiring immunity to disease. This idea is being inculcated in the minds through culture, mass media. In reality, these substances are dangerous poisons, undermining the genetics of the human species, wiping out the existing and future generations.
And moments of absurdity are all that fill the bemusement of despair, of the blanket of suffering that their existence is sown of. It is perhaps a despicable thought indeed, unless we look to Hellenism, where instead we can see this land of Hades and Tartarus as some sort of synthetic system of metaphysical architecture presented to us with the purpose of surrounding us in the opportunity to redeem ourselves. And in this we find that through the Tao and service to each other, we might find ourselves the chance to look elsewhere than loneliness, damnation, and despair. And this is why South Park is so tragic and so essential, and why it's hard for me to not watch every episode as they continue to air, because I become fixated on each character's quest for self-deliverance and self-manifestation, and impressed with the impending doom or resolution that must be coming from their immortal crisis. These children talk and play with Jesus and Satan himself, and yet still do not know how to behave. For an existentialist, it kind of leaves you on the edge of your seat how humanity is going to resolve this. Things have been transforming, of course. I mean, for instance, as Mr. Garrison has become the president, now they no longer take classes in their normal classroom as often. They do have some new replacement teacher, but for the most part, you see all of the students gathered in the auditorium now. This surreptitiously disguises the maturity of their characters, who are no longer in some passing 4th grade. Hypothetically, these youths are like vampires that fill the auditorium in the Tartarus of South Park. And what are the goals to learn in such a game, in such an inferno? Well, it seems to rise above sin and to hit the destinial bullseye. What matters most to others, and to deliver on promises.
If you want to defeat your enemy, bring up his children. Oriental wisdom. Conquest of a nation will become more steady, effective, and almost irreversible if one manages to somehow alter its worldview nationwide, so that the nation willfully serves the interests of the invaders, considering them a part of their normal life. The perfect example of influence on a worldview is the India's caste social system. About 300 million of India's population, classified as the caste of untouchables or little people, live in extreme poverty and believe it is their only possible mode of existence in the society. This example shows the extent to which a worldview can determine the lives of numerous generations over the course of history. Nowadays, there are 2 main types of worldviews that dominate in the society. Kaleidoscopic worldview is typical of people who are unable to find their place in life within the endless flow of events. Every new event just creates more chaos in their perception of the world, just like a new splinter of glass put into a kaleidoscope changes the whole picture. People with mosaic worldview perceive the world as whole and undivided, where everything is causally determined and where accidental events cannot exist. So any new fact or event contributes to this worldview, making it clearer, just like a new fragment added to a mosaic. Unfortunately, the modern culture generates the predominance of kaleidoscopic worldview. This world a hollow pageant you should deem. All wise men know things are not what they seem. Be of good cheer, and drink, and so shake off this vain illusion of a baseless dream. Omar Khayyam.
to ignore cruelty, to focus on love, to accept people for who they are, not who you want them to be, and to prepare for a better tomorrow. The simplest lessons to learn seem like the hardest. It is to have no greed, not to covet, not to have vainglory, to do away with pride, to escape the clutches of lust, to become more creative, to find a creative escape to slothfulness. To not live life in a state of acedia. Acedia is a sort of lost apathy. These are the deadly sins. And to escape Dante's Inferno. And they must be overcome to escape the rings of hell. And to return down back through the Tartarus, to Eden, the walled garden. And every day we stray, just a little bit closer, or just a little bit further, to our goals, our dreams, and our nightmares, depending on how we learn to tolerate our own selves. And whether we can become greater people. Every day we are faced with the oldest of challenges, and it's surprising how many times we all fall back into the trap of repeating them. I do it pretty much every day, multiple times. I think a lot of people in today's facade society could do with a lesson in the difference between lust and love. Ironic, because they are so very different. But the amount of effort that would take, I mean, who cares? Who has the time? This is the kind of logic which headed us toward, and ended us up in, the Tartarus, where everything we've been told is a lie, and everything is upside down. Now, even if you just want to think of this as a far-out abstraction of philosophy, there is a logic to it. Inside of the head of the creator, these characters have not developed past their initial stages, first maturation. Instead, more and more, the world has evolved around them, and they've been forced to face the consequences. It is as if the architect himself is testing them. The creators of South Park might say that this is simply a reflection of the world we're living in, and that answer is no less disconcerting. Perhaps there is some truth to this in our own world, and the tests that we're facing in our own lives. And then it becomes even more freaky because you start thinking about which characters people were when they were growing up, and through the escapades of the South Park adolescents, you can imagine what led a person to become the people they are now. What choices they made which led to their personal dharmas. And South Park becomes even more scary, because then it's a story about your own personal growth and development, and not just that, everyone you know and have ever met, or haven't. All the crazy things that everyone has been through in South Park are things everyone has been through in your own world. Things you've often now been through yourself. And even if you haven't, you've experienced it so well that you can empathize with it. And the suffering of the people of the world becomes more despicable when you notice that they all have the faces of little children underneath their wrinkled years of experience. Each one of them was Kenny or Kyle or Eric or Wendy. Many people are Stan. And the big part of the show is Stan doesn't even know who he is yet, and he's constantly trying to become himself. We are all constantly trying to become ourselves. The boys constantly arranging themselves into clubs to play out these games in costume. Esoteric rituals of roleplay, which lead to many real-life consequences. In fact, I'm not fully clear on this, but I think Leopold Butters Stotch may actually have a glass eye after a rough day with throwing stars, which is hidden from everyone, leading Butters to suffer excruciating pain as he is taken to a veterinarian who attempt to euthanize him. But eventually, Butters ends up back by their side. They all end up processing trauma together, and they go through the hard stuff so you don't have to. Of course, South Park applies to men and women, adults and children, fairly equally. Maybe because it's worked so hard to go so far in so many directions, that it's just covered so much territory. The things that South Park has gotten away with over the years is just unnameable. But let me start with a few of my favorite. For one, of course, is the Scientology episode. The other is using Muhammad. There he is again. There's Muhammad right there. And there's Muhammad using fire to burn a giant statue of Abraham Lincoln. There's Muhammad again with fire. This is Muhammad. I hope you like that. But anyway, doing things like that got South Park in trouble, and they weren't allowed to put that back up. Yep, see, that's it. That's the end. It's censored. You can't see any anymore. That's the end of Muhammad. Not like you can go back in time and just change things. But the Super Best Friends episode is one of the best because it shows a subvert message about Scientology, using Blaintology, David Blaine's personal cult that's been created for the South Park religion, created in the South Park universe. And eventually it requires Joseph Smith, Muhammad, there he is again, there he is one more time, and Jesus and Muhammad, and Buddha, and Krishna, and Lao Tzu, and Seaman. And together the Super Best Friends work together in order to defeat Blaintologists everywhere and stop Blaintology right in its tracks. And this fairy tale was so jarring that it was too early on for anyone to realize what it was about, and so it did not get censored, not right away anyway. But because eventually they did figure it out, they tried to make a more direct episode, speaking to Dianetics and Scientology specifically, where they go in twofold. One, by explaining that the con of Scientology is to charge people money, and that is not an ethical practice for someone who holds on to truth. The other, that the supposed truth of the church, and in relatively good detail, they illustrate what the story is about Xenu. Here, you know what, I'll just...
As you know, there are some people, and one of them is a correspondent for the Village Voice, who says the basic belief system or the basic tenet of the Church of Scientology is to rid the body of space alien parasites, to clear oneself.
Well, John, does that sound silly to you? I mean, it's unrecognizable to me. And actually, no, I'll correct that. There's a small amount of people who talking about what they think Scientology is. They spread it on the internet, and then other people read it, and they think, oh, that must be what it is. Which is why I say people really should just come into the church and see for themselves, find out what it is, and then they can make their own decisions. Read a book by L. Ron Hubbard. You know, pick up a book like Scientology, Fundamentals of Thought, and you can see what Scientology is, what our beliefs are, and what we practice and why, and how people can use Scientology in their lives.
It all began 75 million years ago. Back then, there was a galactic federation of planets, which was ruled over by the evil Lord Xenu.
And they had elected a fellow by the name of Xemu, could be spelled X-E-M-U, to the supreme ruler.
Xenu thought his galaxy was overpopulated.
These planets averaged 178 billion human beings per planet. 178 billion. There were 250 billion on this planet. The name of this planet was Tigiak, and this is known as the bomb place, and this is the evil place. This is the place where they all got smashed.
And so he rounded up countless aliens from all different planets, and then had those aliens frozen.
The trick was to shoot somebody, disable somebody, very often a needle into a lung, and at the same time to hit him with frozen alcohol and glycol, which preparation is guaranteed to pick up a Thetan. All he had to do was pick him up and put him in a refrigerator, and they had him, boy. Because he tried to exteriorize from the body, there he was, frozen.
The frozen alien bodies were loaded onto Xenu's galactic cruisers, which looked like DC-8s, except with rocket engines.
And they threw them into collection points, boxed them up in boxes, threw them into space planes, which are the exact DC-8s. The DC-8 airplane is the exact copy of the space plane of that day.
The cruisers then took the frozen alien bodies to our planet, Earth, and dumped them into the volcanoes of Hawaii.
And they took these people in boxes and so forth, and they dumped them, and then they set off hydrogen bombs on the top of each primary volcano there is on this particular planet.
The aliens were no longer frozen. They were dead. The souls of those aliens, however, lived on, and all floated up towards the sky. But the evil Lord Xenu had prepared for this. Xenu didn't want their souls to return, and so he built giant soul catchers in the sky.
And when they blew up, it blew the Thetans into the air, and after the bomb, an electronic ribbon, which also was a type of standing wave, was erected over the area. The tremendous winds of the planet blew every Thetan there was straight into those particular vacuum zones which had been created.
The souls were taken to a huge soul brainwashing facility, which Xenu had also built on Earth. There the souls were forced to watch days of brainwashing material, which tricked them into believing a false reality.
These were brought down, packed up, and put in front of projection machines, which with sound and color pictures first gave them the implant which you know as clearing course, and then a whole track implanted which you know as OT2. After this, however, about the remainder of the 36 days, which is the bulk of them, is taken up with a 3D super-colossal motion picture, which has to do with God, the devil, space opera, etc. They go 5 pictures to 5 words.
Xenu then released the alien souls, which roamed the Earth aimlessly in a fog of confusion.
It goes on for about 36 days, and then these poor bastards were let wander out.
At the dawn of man, the souls finally found bodies which they could grab onto. They attached themselves to all mankind, which still to this day causes all our fears, our confusions, and our problems.
What? That was just a quote. Fair use. Fair use. Go bother someone else. Anyway, they didn't really like that they got their message outed. And they specifically had no good address to the fact that they were robbing people blind. And eventually this probably helped lead to the current problems in Hollywood with Scientology. Namely that Scientology is a lot less popular than it was 10 years ago. A whole lot less popular. Not everyone's jumping at the bit to say that they want to be a Scientologist. You feel me? Isaac Hayes, he ended up becoming a Scientologist in the 70s, and he got some courseware, and he kind of stayed a bit distant from the religion for many years. When they needed, according to Comedy Central and Viacom, to have at least one, quote, black character, unquote, Trey Parker decided the only person that could do it besides himself was Isaac Hayes. And so they got Isaac Hayes to play the character. Trouble was, I don't think he really knew what he was getting himself into, and some of the stuff was pretty funny, but a lot of the stuff was way less positive and pure than something Isaac Hayes really wanted to be a part of. And after the Scientology episode, he flat out left them, and decided he was never going to do another episode on South Park again. Or well, maybe not for a number of years, but he ended up dying really soon after, when Scientologists took over his life and refused to allow him medical treatment. Totally a bummer. Isaac Hayes is pretty cool, I thought. I mean, look at his sweater. I think I have one just like that. But this is not the first time someone had their life destroyed by Scientology, and there's too many numbers of examples, but I'll give you Jason Lee, Stink Palm from Mallrats, and Earl from My Name is Earl, an epic skateboarder and actor, and a pretty cool guy from all accounts. Unfortunately, he became a Scientologist, and after a while, they started controlling his life. Probably not very long at all, really. And if you ever wondered why you haven't seen him in a while, after My Name is Earl just all of a sudden up and ended, quite randomly, and why him and his wife are living and hiding in Texas right now. Well, there you go. Go ahead and look into that. But anyway, the Scientology episode was pulled as well, so they decided to make another episode about the Super Adventure Club, wherein, more specifically than even in the Scientology or the Blaintology episode, exposed is the world pedophile cult, where a number of elite hunters, who together make up the lodge of the Super Adventure Club, reveal the secrets of their long-dead master hit by a train, who had discovered that pedophilia had made him immortal, up until the train accident. And in their lodge, the Super Adventure Club worked together to bring back some sort of a beastly ghost version of Chef. Eventually, the aliens who like to watch the show Earth decide to cancel us. And so, perhaps because of their relationship with the cows, and perhaps not, the boys end up again inside of a spaceship, which is still a pretty rare occasion. It's only like the third or sixth time. But they find out the ways of the universe, and how the Jusians run all the entertainment in the entire universe. Taking candid photos of the Jusian producers in compromising circumstances, they are able to convince, persuade, blackmail the Jusian producers to keep the Earth show running, something clearly enough of the universal audience appears to want. So they are returned to Earth, and the world is saved, and the veil is placed back over their faces. And so, life goes on. Is it just me, or is there something particularly melancholy about the snow? Living in the snow. I mean, it seems great, but it's also pretty cold. And there's just moments where everything becomes beautiful, where everything becomes colorful. And for the most part, the blanket of snow is sort of like fire, as if instead of burning in hell, it is frozen over. And so, in protection and boots, they have to carefully wade their way through the world, to and from their homes, always in cahoots for some crazy goal, to build a ladder to heaven, or to be the biggest mall sensational pop star group, Fingerbang. The introduction of PC Principle to the metacosm of South Park is in order to save the children and the entire community itself from the halted moment of Brigadoon that the town has found itself in.
I'm here because this place is lost in a time warp. In other words,
and in this scenario, you can see how everyone is being forced with the opportunity to change into the best person they can be. And this transforms South Park's sensibilities from vulgarity to essentiality. And their personal hell is formed of ads, PC culture, and gentrification, and neoliberalism.
What is PC but a verbal form of gentrification? Spruce everything up, get rid of all the ugliness in order to create a false sense of paradise? Only one thing can actually live in that world. Ads.
One of the fundamental tenets of neoliberalism is that the citizen's primary obligation is to be a consumer. Essentially, the hell that Trey Parker and Matt Stone are wrestling with in South Park is the idea that freedom need not be marketable. To an opponent that feels that everything is an advertisement, even the ideals of multiculturalism and diversity end up suiting the engines of capitalism and conflicting with the local impoverished community, leaving Kenny off worse than he was before. One might say that the advertisements are stand-in for the grossly inhuman forces of neoliberal capitalism, the ultimate weapon and villain in the South Park story against these children. This leads these children to question not only what is cool and what they are, but whether or not everything they love is an ad, and whether or not they're advertisements themselves. Have they, each and every one of them, been programmed into neurolinguistic propaganda? How can they be sure which ideals are their own, and where can they stand? This leaves the South Park residents confused about their own ideals and their own moral ethic. And without moral and ethic, they are forced to engage in these routine escapades, where every time and again, the most utilitarian of lessons is learned, that the ultimate right answer for everyone is essentially the best answer for anyone, out of selfishness. For this reason, often Eric Cartman is considered to be the ultimate protagonist of South Park. This is incorrect. However, it is namely for the fault that Eric Cartman is the most hedonistic character, and so he is often getting the most out of life. The most including the most suffering of trials and tribulations, and bad karma as well, of course. Cartman often finds himself seeking the most short-sighted of goals, and neglecting to notice and observe the not too far off consequences, which time and time again repeatedly conflict with his contentment. Often it is the most repulsive that we find the most attractive. Cartman's allure, both in ourselves and to find him in other people, and in each other, cause us to eventually love Cartman despite his faults, and in fact often because of them. This confusion of attraction is not the same as love, and it is of course acting on these impulses, which leads to all sorts of other problems for other people, from jealousy and envy to rage and revenge. The lesson is learned that with knowledge comes sorrow, and often existentialism is despair. The more lessons, the more pain, and the less certainty, and the resulting jade from the shattered heart of men, stone cold and emptied. This is a kind of sorrow that only a human can understand. And in this way, South Park is actually rather biblical, because rather than present heroes for deification, each character has their own sin and vice and problems, and it is made very clear that all of their problems affect each other. The often unsung sorrow of Bebe, beautiful, but knowing she's not very good at math, somewhat terrified that she must rely on her passing looks, as her own mother once did, before wrestling herself a consolatory husband in home. Yet who amongst them should she rely on for such a fate? Which one of these boys would make a good man? How can they be loved? How can they love in return? Do they even understand that love is patient, that love is kind, that it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, that love does not dishonor others, that love is not self-seeking, not easily angered, keeps no records of wrong, that love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth, that love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres, that love never fails, and that when there are prophecies, they will cease, when there are tongues, they will be stilled, and where there is knowledge, it will pass away. How much of that do any of the boys understand? And will any of them ever be ready to really love Bebe and care for Bebe? Seriously, I think that Bebe might be one of the most under-illustrated tragedies of South Park. I mean, who knows where her future might lead, where any of ours will. And if anything, Wendy's disconcerting body dysmorphic disorder may give her the engine and faculty needed to rise above her own appearance and to become something great, something intellectual, something useful. But over the years, I've learned to distrust her, knowing with prophecy what holds her future. Though I'll save the bit about Wendy's future for a bit later. Or Leanne, her more secret, more accurate identity. The Enneagram of personality, from the words Ennea meaning 9, and gramma meaning something written or drawn, is a model of human psyche which is principally understood and taught as a typology of 9 interconnected personality types. Although the origins and history of many of the ideas and theories associated with the Enneagram of personality are a matter of dispute, contemporary Enneagram theories are principally derived from the teachings of the Japanese Bolivian psychospiritual teacher Oscar Chazo from the 1950s and the Chilean psychiatrist Claudio Naranjo from the 1970s. Naranjo's theories were also influenced by some earlier teachings about personality by George Kirchhoff. Gurdjieff was a mystic, a philosopher, a spiritual teacher, and a composer of Armenian and Greek descent. Born in Alexandropol, now Gyumri, in Armenia, Gurdjieff taught that most humans do not possess a unified consciousness, and that thus live their lives in a state of hypnotic, waking sleep, but that it is possible to awaken to a higher state of consciousness and to achieve full human potential. Gurdjieff described a method attempting to do so called the discipline of the work, connoting the work on oneself or the system. According to his principles and instruction, Gurdjieff's method for awakening one's consciousness unites the methods of the fakir, monk, and yogi.
Shut your fucking face, Uncle Fucker! You're a bunny biting bastard, Uncle Fucker! Thought I told you that we won't stop! Thought I told you that we won't stop!
Back to you, Tom.
Thus, he referred to it as the fourth way. The fourth way is an approach to self-development, developed by Gurdjieff over years of travel in the East, from the 1890s into the early 20th century. The fourth way combines and harmonizes what Gurdjieff saw as three established traditional ways, or schools, of thought, those of the emotion, the body, and the mind, or of the monks, the fakirs, and yogas. Students often refer to the fourth way as the work. The fourth way differs in that it has not a permanent way. It has no specific form or institutions, and comes and goes controlled by some particular laws of its own. This chaotic principle, this is the game of life. And when this work is finished, that is to say, when the aim set before it has been accomplished, the fourth way disappears. That is, it disappears from the given place, disappears in its given form, continuing perhaps in another place, in another form. Schools of the fourth way exist for the needs of the work which is being carried out in the connection with the proposed undertaking. They never exist by themselves as schools for the purpose of education or instruction, just for the moment at hand. Whereas people ordinarily live in a state of semi-hypnotic waking sleep, through the fourth way, through the game of life, through exchange, and through empathy, the higher levels of consciousness, virtue, unity, and free will are all possible. This is the kind of game that South Park is playing with their minds, to manifest the highest of human spirit, to exist in such a broad sense that they can exist outside of themselves. In fact, they have to, in order to be more than they can be on their own. To wake up from the Vindaloop, they all must wake up together. And like the spirit of Siddhartha, every time one of them has a moment of clarity and awakening, they are sent back in order to evangelize, as the Buddha did within the South Park Vindaloop, and help each other again to fulfill that goal of self-manifestation, an awakening from the Tartarus into nirvana. This is the ultimate goal in the celebration of the show, and I think it's a reason why the show hasn't been canceled. Because otherwise it would have gotten boring for Trey Parker a long time ago. There seems to be some sort of works of destiny at stake here. In Season 20, where the world ended, member berries destroy the minds of the community, and a then terrified of cyberbullying, and now feminist advocate, Eric Cartman, begins his relationship with a fair and beautiful and just Heidi Turner. A beautiful girl working herself with Elon Musk on a program that can decipher any online troll's activities, soon bringing transparency to the actions of everyone on the internet, something that terrifies Eric himself. And you have to wonder whether Cartman was seriously not trolling everyone when he started selling pastries to support the Danish against cyberbullying and made t-shirts that said Danishes for Denmark. I mean, after all, whether or not it's an intentional piece of ethno-nationalist propaganda, it's certainly effective. But this is a good point to bring up how Mr. Garrison became the president of South Park and the United States of the South Park universe. This is a big reason why 2016 broke the show in a lot of ways. South Park has rules. There's a certain kind of writing that Trey Parker ascribes to.
Please welcome the Emmy Award-winning and Tony Award-winning creators of South Park, Matt Stone and Trey Parker. You think I'm kidding, right? Hey!
Our whole South Park writers' room, one whole wall is one of these. And we've got it split up into 3 acts.
We have different colored markers just like here, too. Look at
Yep.
We have that.
And I walk around with the markers like this, and we'll go, okay, we do a show about this.
This is
like,
our writer's room.
Oh, okay, well, somewhere, okay, this would be a funny scene if we had
That's
this.
true.
Each individual scene has to work as a kind of funny sketch. You don't want one scene that's just like, well, what was the point of that scene? We found out this really simple rule that maybe you guys have all heard before, but it took us a long time to learn it. But we can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words "and then" belong between those beats, you're f***ed, basically. You got something pretty boring. What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word "therefore" or "but." Right? So what I'm saying is that you come up with an idea and it's like, okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No, it should be this happens, and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. And that, as soon as we are able to, and literally sometimes we'll write it out to make sure we're doing it. We'll have our beats and we'll say, okay, this happened, but then this happens, and that affects this, and that does to that, and that's why you get a show that feels like, okay, this to that, to this to that, but this, here's the complication, to that. And there's so many scripts we read from new writers and things that we see.
God, I see movies.
And
you see movies that you're just watching, and it's like, this happened, and then this happens, and then this happens. That's when you're in a movie just going, what the f*** am I watching this movie for? Just like, this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. That's not a movie, you know, that's not a story. Like Trey said, it's those two, but, because, therefore, that gives you the causation between each beat, and that's a story.
Yeah.
Is a better story. Up until this point, for the last 21 years, South Park had continued a line of progression. Therefore this happened, but then this happened, therefore this happened. Continually. Suddenly, the day after the election, forced to rewrite an entire week's worth of material. Not just that, deal with the fact that the President of the United States who had been elected was so clearly not the Hillary Clinton that everyone was expecting the media to air as the winner. Whether or not she won, which of course had nothing to do with it. In fact, that's even more of a surprise. And so the show breaks down, and so South Park and indeed our entire reality is left in a sort of crisis, where instead of therefore consequently, the reality of the situation was instead, and then Mr. Garrison became president. Now, John G. Trump, the uncle of Donald Trump, is a time traveler, some would say. And the inauguration of President Trump did happen when he was divinely 77 years, 7 months, and 7 days old. It seems like there's just too much planning there to be that surprised, but okay. In theory, they were genuinely surprised, but I remain even here a skeptic. And at this point, the entire moral of the season starts to disintegrate, where the otherwise toxic member berries that members of society are tripping out to, considered to be some sort of great conspiratorial force, win. And at this point, the member berries transform into wine, and the member berry wine becomes a toxic projectile virus, which infects everyone. In fact, very quickly and very secretly, the member berry virus infects the entire world. And all of a sudden, this storyline doesn't seem so out of the blue, but more predictive programming for what was to come. But if you look back now, it was pretty clear. I mean, if people want a member, they're gonna member.
What's the password, member? Yeah, I member. You member? I member. Member this place? Sure, I member. Hi, it's us, member. Sure, I don't member. We did the thing with throwing Mickey in a drink, member. Oh, sure, I member. It's because of yous we won the election. Yeah, maybe. Wait a round of drinks for our heroes here, maybe. Hi, maybe. You done good poisoning the lady's drink. Now our man is in office, maybe. But I still have things I need you to do. Hi, maybe. Remember stormtroopers? Sure, hi, maybe. Not those stormtroopers. The real old ones. People want a member? They're gonna member.
I kind of have to wonder if these fascistic little member berries are actually the grapes of wrath. Now, sorry to get all Steinbeck on you, but the American realist novel published in 1939, The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1962, tells the tale during the Great Depression of the Jodes, a poor family of tenant farmers driven from their Oklahoma home by drought, economic hardship, agricultural industry changes, and bank foreclosures, forcing the tenant farmers out of work. Due to their nearly hopeless situation, and in part because they are trapped in the Dust Bowl, the Jodes set out for California, along with thousands of other Okies seeking jobs, land, dignity, and a future. Reaching California, they find the state oversupplied with labor, wages are low, and workers are exploited to the point of starvation. Big corporate farmers are in collusion, and small farmers suffer from collapsing prices. In response to the exploitation, Casey becomes a labor organizer and tries to recruit for a labor union. And in the final chapter of the book, the family takes shelter from the flood in an old barn. Inside they find a young boy and his father who is dying of starvation. Rose and Sharon take pity on the man and offer him her breast milk to save him from starvation. And I can't help but wonder, are these the very member berries that these grapes of wrath are hoping that we'll remember? However, simultaneously to the member berries taking over society, Troll Trace is about to go online. And Hillary Clinton herself is worried about not just her own, but many other state secrets that would be remembered. And so a secret operation begins to end not only trolling, but Denmark's troll tracing program, but destroy Denmark and the very internet itself. And it turns out, wouldn't you know it, that Hillary Clinton lied, and that she really was just trying to protect her own emails. And so she's been working for the Danish troll trace program all along. And at the end of the day, all sides agree, the internet must be destroyed. Too many secrets, too many faults, too many mistakes made. Everyone can agree to let men's memories die. The right to be forgotten is a very ancient right indeed, and is still law in some countries. Eventually, it was a dream that Eric had, total recall like Memento, where through tantric therapy, Eric saw the future. He saw man and woman living together on Mars. And on Mars, on the surface, the women controlled everything, even the below, where all the men were safe, in cages, like dairy cows, milked from their prostates, and forced to invent jokes for their women masters above. This was the clear, undeniable conclusion of all the consequences which had faced them in the world, and this is why they had to work together in order to change things, to change their destiny. And in the end, it was Elon Musk himself, actually Elon Musk, he voiced his own character, who helped save the day for South Park and the world by destroying the entire internet. And when it came back on, whatever it was, what was left of what had been, not one amongst us can say. And this was the beginning of the new world order. And the world that the children emerged out into was very different than the one before.
Telling me what you heard me.